All right, let's begin by understanding the key characteristics of monopolistic competition. And to start, we'll look at a little bit of history. So in the 1920s and 30s, economists were aware of industries that sort of didn't fit the perfect competition model, and they didn't fit the pure monopoly model either. And really, it's because these two models are sort of extreme ends of a spectrum of types of industries. So, of course, there's going to be things that are somewhere in between these two types of firms. And so there was both theoretical research and empirical research, empirical using data, that sort of was the reason for developing this model of monopolistic competition. And there were actually two separately developed models of monopolistic competition that were they were developed simultaneously, actually, right at the same time. So at Harvard, this economist named Edward Chamberlain, who was actually the grandfather of experimental economics, he was the advisor of my advisor's advisor, if that makes sense. So only 4 degrees of separation between him and I. But he published this theory of monopolistic competition in 1933. I believe that was a book. And then in that same year, a woman, Joan Robinson of Cambridge, published The Economics of Imperfect Competition. So these two actually developed these models of monopolistic competition separately. And today, our models of monopolistic competition are sort of blends of these two. All right, so what is monopolistic competition? How is it characterized? So it's basically just any market situation in which there's lots of firms that produce similar products but not identical products. Okay, so there are lots of firms, just like perfect competition, but the slight difference here is that their products are not identical, like wheat farmers, for example, but they're just very similar, but not identical. Okay, so think like Pepsi and Coke. Okay. Another key aspect is that entry is relatively easy, not free, so maybe slightly higher barriers to entry than perfect competition, but it's very close to being free entry and exit. So there are a significant number of sellers. Okay, we've already been over that. And there's a high degree of competition, right? Very competitive, differentiated products, not identical. And basically what this leads to is sales, promotion, and advertising. And of course, there's easy entry and exit in the long run. So this is going to lead to basically the firms making zero economic profit in the long run. What are some of the implications of the large number of firms? Well, it means that each individual firm has a small market share. There's a lack of collusion, which is when firms collectively act together to behave as if they are collectively a monopoly in order to increase their profits. That's what collusion is. There are other types of collusion, I guess, but that's the main one. And so, because there's so many of them, they act as if they're independent, right? That's kind of the result of no collusion, or that's why there's no collusion, is because they're so small relative to the market, and there's so many of them, they basically act as if they're independent from one another. All right, so product differentiation, pretty much just like it sounds. Firms try to make their products stand out from their competitors, whether it's through branding or quality or advertising, any of these things, other minor attributes, right? Packaging and product presentation, all of these things, right? These are all things that help firms distinguish themselves from their competitors, which is what we call product differentiation. All right, so how does this relate to price, this product differentiation? Well, as it turns out, Different from perfect competition, firms in monopolistically competitive industries have some degree of market power. They have some ability to determine the price that they charge for their product. And so this is really because they face a downward sloping demand curve. Their demand curve is not flat. It's not horizontal. It's not perfectly elastic like the demand curve that perfectly competitive firms face. So, just to think more about this, consider how many brand names there are for many products, right? And think about the more successful the firm is at differentiating, the more it has control over its price. So if it can really make its product different than its competitors, then it's kind of pushing itself closer to the monopoly end of the spectrum, where you have products with no close substitutes. Really, that's the idea here with product differentiation, is trying to make your product so much different than your competitors that you're getting closer to the monopoly end of the spectrum, and so you can, as the firm, increase your profits. Okay, so think about this example. When a drink's taste is not sufficiently distinguishable, try a flavored edible straw. Okay, I've never heard of this or seen this, but following Starbucks, apparently, some restaurants have begun to offer drinking straws with different flavors, such as cookies and meats, which sounds absolutely disgusting. But these edible straws are meant to differentiate products in a monopolistically competitive restaurant market. Okay. Again, I've never heard of this. If you have heard of it, maybe mention in the discussion post that you've heard of this or seen this before. All right, so all of these things sort of create an environment where advertising becomes a reality. It becomes something that firms use to help them distinguish their products from their competitors. So think about advertising and think about whether a perfect competitor would have an incentive to advertise, and think about whether a monopoly would have an incentive to advertise. Think about that. In fact, why don't we use these questions as our discussion topic, right? I want you to post whether you believe that a perfectly competitive firm has any incentive to advertise, whether you believe that a monopoly has any incentive to advertise, and tell us why as well, why you have that belief, okay? And then here's another interesting question. You don't have to make this part of your discussion forum post, but can advertising lead to efficiency? So we'll actually answer that one in a bit. So what are the points of advertising? What does it do? Why do firms do it in the first place? Well, it's the main goal is to increase demand for their product in the firm. It also helps to differentiate their product from competitors. And the main goal is to increase demand so that the firm can make more money, more profit, right? So those are the points of sales, promotions, and advertising. So here's a question. How much advertising should be undertaken? Well, really, it's a matter of cost-benefit analysis for the firm. It wants to spend... It basically wants to equalize marginal revenue with marginal cost when we're talking about the marginal cost of advertising. So if it spends $1 on its first dollar on advertising and it increases revenues by $3, then yeah, the firm wants to do it, right? If it gets $3 by spending $1, that's a profit. That's an additional profit or a marginal profit of $2. And so as long as the additional revenue is greater than the additional cost of advertising, then it wants to continue to increase its advertising spending, and it will do so up until the point where its marginal cost of advertising is exactly equal to the marginal revenue that it receives from those advertisements, right? So that's basically the answer here, right? It should be carried to the point at which the additional revenue from one more dollar of advertising just equals that $1 of additional cost, right? So they're applying this marginal cost, marginal benefit analysis, right? And that's what's going on. All right, we'll wrap up this section talking about ease of entry, the ease of entry for monopolistically competitive firms. So basically, the barriers to entry are very low, not free necessarily, but very, very close to zero. And so for any current monopolistic competitor, there's always potential competition sort of lurking in the background. Ooh. And so the easier or less costly it is, the more a current competitor must worry about losing their business as a result of competition entering the market. Okay. All right, so let's wrap this section up with a policy example. Want to start a kids' TV network? Bring back old cartoon characters. So the Boomerang Network, maybe you've heard of it, decided to enter the crowded kids' TV programming industry at the lowest cost. Because it could barely pay to develop new shows that meet government standards ensuring age-appropriate content, Boomerang placed old FCC-approved characters such as Bugs Bunny and Scooby-Doo into new TV shows. So pretty smart strategy there. Low cost, and that was really the only way they were able to compete with Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network.